Okay, Erev Tov. Hope everybody who's been in the path of this very robust snowstorm is doing fine. I'm happy we managed to successfully have tefillah and successfully keep the maintenance guys at home, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. But of course, if you need anything, don't hesitate to be in touch. And it's great to carry on forward with Dr. Brachi Elitzur's essays on Sefer Shemot. Really, the second half is more of a ongoing series, not sort of Parsha by Parsha, but trying to tackle almost the entirety of the second half through addressing a number of key questions. And in a way, this connects to the first essay. So the first essay, that being the one on Parshat Shemot. So just to refresh our memory and also catch up on last week's, which will set us up for where she's picking up from. In Chumash Shemot at the Burning Bush, she argued that God and Moshe were not just discussing Moshe's charge to go take Bnei Israel out of Egypt and to accept leadership of Bnei Israel, but also debating the question of what would be the most effective mode for God to communicate, manifest in relationship with Bnei Israel. And God, so to speak, proposed a more verbal, auditory model. God would speak to Moshe, Moshe would speak to Bnei Israel, and Moshe was convinced that that would not be sufficient for this downtrodden people distanced from their God to reconnect, renew their faith, and be ready to begin a national relationship with that God. And that what would be necessary is God presenting God's self in a much more visual, signs and wonders kind of format. God acquiesces. Again, this is kind of the way she describes it. God acquiesces, and it is indeed signs and wonders much more than the delivery of spoken word or of verbal messages. That is the way God is present from the time Moshe goes down to Egypt to the time of the Exodus. And then after Har Sinai, which kind of is the culminating event, splitting of the sea, and Har Sinai, culminating events of God's more manifest presence, signs, wonders, and some kind of almost visual, perceptible experience. After that, God then tells Moshe, Hinei anochi sholech malach lefanecha, I'm going to send a messenger. And the implication seems to be that, okay, God is, finished that first phase. The relationship has been established, and now it can transition to what was all along God's preferred method, that God would communicate, verbally through Moshe, and Moshe would transmit God's word to Bnei Israel, and the relationship would be sustained that way. Moshe protests that Bnei Israel is not yet ready. This, of course, is off script, but this is what she imagines happens in the gap between God's announcement that God is going to send this messenger, this angel in God's stead, at the end of Parshat Mishpatim, and then the beginning of Parshat Truma, where God gives Moshe the instructions for the tabernacle. That what's happening in that little space is that, Moshe is saying to God, no, we're not ready to shift to the malach and to your mode of verbal leadership. We still need your presence to be with us. And God, again, imagining, acquiesces and says, okay, in that case, we should have a mishkan, a structure in which my presence can be with Bnei Israel ongoing. And she has argued that, with that, she's going to now attempt to answer the questions of why so many details in the Mishkan, why does the Torah spend so much time talking about it, and why does it repeat it in Teruma and then again in Vayakel Pekude when the messages or the commands are carried out. So that's where we left off at the end of the essay on Teruma. She's now carrying on with step 2 of it here in Tetzaveh. So we won't get so much analysis of any of the details of Parshat Tetzaveh, priestly garments, inauguration rituals for the tabernacle, but we are carrying on this broader analysis of how is God's presence manifest in relationship with Bnei Israel in the book of Shemot and going forward. And This is a pretty long essay. Try to make our way through, and let's jump right in. So, okay, Tetzaveh, the argument over the path to faith and its expressions in the Parshiot of the Mishkan. Again, as you see here, nothing so particular to Parshat Tetzaveh, but this being the focus of the second half of the book of Shemot. We concluded the shiur in Parshat Teruma with the suggestion that the laws of the Mishkan, let's see if I can enlarge this just a little bit, with the suggestion that the laws of the Mishkan were conveyed to Moshe when he ascended on Mount Sinai to receive the first tablets as a gesture of compromise. Right? Moshe had objected to God's decree that an angel would replace the direct and immediate divine providence that had accompanied Bnei Israel until this point, and the laws of the Mishkan represented a compromise between the two positions. Based on this assumption, which is a big assumption, because the Torah never says that conversation happened between God and Moshe, but the Torah does say, God says, I'm going to send a malach, and then the Torah says that God says to Moshe, tell Bnei Israel to build a Mishkan, that I'm going to dwell in their midst. So what happened between point A and point B? Based on this assumption, we shall now address 3 questions which we raised in last week's Parsha concerning the final 5 Parshiot of Sefer Shemot. 1. The extensive detail concerning the building materials, manner of construction of the vessels, and their dimensions. 2. The location of the account of the sin of the golden calf in the midst of the Parshiot about the Mishkan. She spent some time talking about that in last week's essay, that for Rashi, really, the Mishkan is a response to the sin of the golden calf, but that's out of order. For the Ramban, the Mishkan was always intended, and for her, it's neither. It's not out of order, but it also wasn't always intended. It's a response to God's plan to shift to a malach, and Moshe's contention that that's not enough for the Jewish people. And then 3, the lengthy repetition of details in the description of the actual building in Vayakhel and Pekudei. The laws of the Mishkan are characterized by the minute detail of the description of the manner of construction, the materials used, the dimensions of the vessels and their purpose, to the point where we cannot but wonder at the need for such meticulous attention to these fine points. The last Parsha in which we encountered a specification of dimensions and building materials was Parshat Noach. I've seen very few connections between the Mishkan and Noach. This is just like an interesting point in the command to Noach to build the ark, right? Getting measures of length, width, and depth, or length, width, and height. However, while the precision in that instance may be explained as arising from the ark's intended function to protect its inhabitants from the flood, okay, we need to know that it's big enough, although again, as we talked about actually last week, maybe it wasn't big enough, but it's designed to be a kind of thing which is structured to serve a certain function, and we need to understand its dimensions to understand that. When it comes to the Mishkan, it would seem that the dimensions or form of the structure would in no way affect the accommodation of the divine presence, which is not dependent on any natural elements, meaning the Mishkan could be anything to be a divine home. So what's the function of all the details, and why do we need them in the Torah? The argument between God and Moshe concerning the proper guidance of Am Yisrael to lead them to wholehearted faith in God is a theme that can help us understand the need for such detail in the laws of the Mishkan, right? So the theme she's been tracking all the way through, which is how does God's presence appear with Bnei Israel, is going to help us answer this question. We recall that Moshe, starting at the burning bush, she's now reviewing what I reviewed before we started, but now we'll get a review of the review and hear it from her. We recall that Moshe, starting at the burning bush, emphasizes the need to provide the people with visual proof of God's presence. Moshe believes that divine service requires tangible means, cannot at this early stage be based on intellectual recognition alone. God wants to speed up the transition to an abstract mode of divine service based upon the power of mind. God's acquiescence to Moshe's request that God's presence rest constantly in the midst of the camp puts a halt on this process that God had sought, perhaps even canceling it altogether in favor of Moshe's approach, right? God wanted just to be, the way the Rambam describes it. You contemplate God's essence, that's all you need to do. Moshe says, we need you in our midst, and God says, okay, the Mishkan. The agency of a tangible intermediary in divine service poses 2 dangers. One is that the means can become the end. We shall make a name for ourselves, right? That's a reference to Migdal Bavel, right? Which was possibly meant to reach heaven in order to connect to God, but then it became about the project itself and what it did for the builders. The other is the possibility of being carried away in religious ecstasy to the point where a person acting out of religious motives ends up severing himself from the true purpose of divine service. Right? So if God's approach was just, mind meld and connect with me, and Moshe says, no, we need something, a mishkan, a sense of your presence. So now Dr. Elitzur wants to say, but what are the risks in Moshe's approach? One is you start worshiping the mishkan. We have that kind of idea, in the prophets, the concern that the people just became obsessed with the tabernacle as an indication of their security. Or two, you sort of focus on the not worshiping the service, but getting so into the service that you actually lose that it's there to connect you to God. The means become an end when the person views the means, inter alia, as a way of expressing himself, his abilities, and the manner in which the means influences him. The very specific laws here preclude any such possibility. Every act is dictated in advance, and the finished product must precisely match the instructions. So here she wants to say, having the details of the Mishkan there makes sure that the worship of the Mishkan can't really become about anything other than the worship, because you can't really insert a personal element into it. It can't really be about you, the worshiper, which is a slightly different way than I explained it first, but can't really be about you, the worshiper, and your kind of connection to the Mishkan. It's all so clearly laid out. There's no kind of personal dimension to it. Likewise, the detailed laws serve to direct the awe and wonder at this means to its source, to God who planned the Mishkan in all its impressive precision. Ecstasy is the result of an absence of boundaries. It reflects an emotional transport led by the heart, ignoring or not conscious of the environment and its accepted norms. The precise specifications concerning the entire process of the divine service in the Mishkan leave no room for a person to sever himself from the environment. The religious experience of divine service in the sanctuary is in fact dependent on one being absolutely connected to the relevant laws and consciously aware of their divine source. Right? So you can't kind of just get caught up in the service and not connect it to God when you're in the Mishkan, because the whole sense of the Mishkan, its grandeur, its detail, is there to help you remember that this is oriented towards God. And we could quibble on the details in their interpretation, but this is her argument. The structure of the Mishkan is meant to acknowledge and temper the concerns that the Mishkan brings up. The Mishkan is there because God acknowledges Moshe's argument that Bnei Israel need a means to connect to God and a way of sensing God's presence. But that runs some risks, but the Mishkan is literally built in a way to try to avoid those risks. Another characteristic of the laws of the Mishkan and its sacrificial service is the opaqueness of their purpose. The laws of the Mishkan come with no accompanying theoretical explanation, and the reasons for the sacrifices are not given in the text. This opaqueness on one hand, and the multiplicity of detail on the other, reinforce the sense of man's subservience to the divine command. Through his actions he expresses acknowledgement of God's good laws and God's judgment which a person shall perform and live by them, even when their reason is concealed from him. Now, this is an interesting take because this presumes the sense of the whole experience of service in the Mishkan as kind of foreign and inscrutable to us. Obviously, people like the Rambam and other interpreters would say we may not be able to, recapture that reason and the structure, but to the people who lived at that time, all the vessels and all the sacrifices and everything, we understood why they were and what they were there to do. But certainly for us readers, we read it and we are struggling to understand why this size, why this shape, why two altars, why this kind of animal for this sacrifice. And so we kind of recognize, well, we don't know the reasons for any of these things, but the idea here is to serve God, and we don't need to understand all of the reasons, right? So that's a part of what the Mishkan helps develop. Thus, the laws of the Mishkan represent, on the one hand, a foregoing of the ideal of divine service through the power of thought and speech, but on the other hand, they do not allow man to become seduced by the means, right? So it's not God's desired approach, it's what Moshe thinks the people needs, but it also counteracts the potential pitfalls of that. They remind him at every stage of his interaction what the purpose of the Mishkan service is. The laws of the Mishkan in all their detail allow a person to express his subservience to God in his every religious act, while simultaneously preventing him from becoming fixated with the aspect of his worship as a value in their own right. The sin of the golden calf and the significance of its location in the text. The golden calf, because now we're on to the second question. If the first question was, why all the details? Why is the Mishkan structured this way? She's attempted to answer that, to counteract the potential pitfalls of the concession to Moshe of having God's presence in the midst of the Jewish people. Now, the second question, why does the golden calf then show up in between the command and the execution? The golden calf validates the divine concern that Am Yisrael would become addicted to a tangible form of worship. A temporary absence causes them to seek an alternative that was not part of the pure divine service which had been commanded to them at Mount Sinai and in the laws accompanying that revelation. Okay, now remember, she's going to address this later, in the way she's reading the text, Moshe has gotten the commands about the Mishkan, but has not yet delivered them to Bnei Israel. They don't know that they're being commanded to build a Mishkan. They just know that Moshe hasn't come down the mountain yet, and because he has tarried, and because we see that, these concerns about tangible worship are real, we see exactly where they lead us. We don't have Moshe. We need to connect to God. We need some physical, concrete thing to worship. Or we need an alternative to God, and we need something physical and concrete to worship. In Sefer HaKuzari, a temporary absence caused them to seek an alternative that was not part of the divine service which had been commanded them at Mount Sinai and in the laws accompanying that revelation. In Sefer HaKuzari, Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi writes, the people did not pay so much attention to the law as to a tangible image in which they believed, right? Sort of narrating the sin of the golden calf. Bnei Israel had been promised that something visible would descend on them from God, which they could follow, as they followed the pillars of cloud and fire when they departed from Egypt. This they pointed out and turned to it, praising it and worshipping God in its presence. Thus they also turned towards the cloud which hovered over Moshe while God spoke with him. They remained standing and adoring God in its presence. Now when the people had heard the proclamation of the Ten Commandments, and Moshe had ascended the mountain in order to receive the inscribed tablets which he was to bring down to them, and then to make an ark which was to be the point toward which they should direct their gaze during their devotions, they waited for his return, clad in the same clothes in which they had witnessed the drama on Sinai, without removing their jewels or changing their clothes, remaining just as he left them, expecting every moment to see him return. This is an interpretation of some psukim about the taking off their jewels later, etc. He, however, tarried 40 days, although he had not taken provisions, having only left them with the intention of returning the same day. An evil spirit overpowered a portion of the people, and they began to divide into parties and factions. Many views and opinions were expressed. It's kind of like the Kuzari is almost like a little mini midrash here on the story of the golden calf. Until at last some decided to do like the other nations and seek an object in which they could have faith. This was in no way meant to prejudice the supremacy of the God who had brought them out of Egypt. On the contrary, they sought only some tangible object to which they could direct themselves when relating the wonders of God. Okay, so this is the danger. They're looking for something tangible because they don't have Moshe. They want to connect to God, and they've until now had a God who sort of shows up, so they're used to something to connect to. On the other hand, this is back to Dr. Elitzur, Moshe's insistence that the nation was not yet ready for a completely abstract mode of faith and worship is likewise borne out by the people's response to a situation devoid of any tangible elements. When the people saw that Moshe tarried to come down from the mountain, the people gathered to Aaron and said to him, "Arise, make us a god who will go before us, for this man Moshe, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." The nation's response to Moshe's prolonged absence reveals their dependence and lack of confidence. They're like a young child who's not yet weaned of his complete dependence on his parents and experiences separation anxiety whenever the people familiar to him are not nearby. Would it be possible to wean the people off a tangible mode of leadership at this stage, as they face the challenges of the wilderness, not yet having reached the permanent habitation that is meant to give them a sense of security? And so, the sin of the golden calf. And now, God's response. God's response to the sin of the golden calf is not long in coming. God announces the reinstatement of the mode of leadership represented by the angel, thereby nullifying the gesture of the Mishkan. Again, Bnei Israel haven't heard about the Mishkan. Only Moshe knows about the Mishkan. But now God says to Moshe, after the sin of the golden calf, Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt, to the land which I promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, saying, to your descendants I shall give it, and I shall send an angel before you. And I shall drive out the Canaani, the Amori, the Chiti, and the Perizi, the Chivi, and the Yevusi, into a land flowing with milk and honey, for I shall not go up in your midst, for you are a stiff-necked people, lest I consume you on the way. Now you'll remember last week she reminded us that Rashi says this angel is the same angel as back in Parshat Mishpatim, and it's a response to the sin of the golden calf. And back there, God was just telling Moshe, Bnei Israel is going to sin, and with the sin of the golden calf, and therefore I'm going to have to move away from them and send this angel, this messenger angel. In her reading, the angel was God's attempt to move away from the tangible mode of leadership. Moshe convinced God they needed it, so God instructed the Mishkan, but then came the sin of the golden calf, and then God said, I can't do this Mishkan because I can't tolerate being in your midst because you're so difficult to deal with. Ramban comments, after this, God once again tells Moshe, go up from here, you and the people, as if to say that the plague will not erase their sin, such that I might dwell in their midst. Thus Am Yisrael suffer two punishments. One is that God's presence will not dwell in their midst. The second is that God will send an angel before Moshe to drive out the nations, but after they inherit the land, there is no promise of even an angel to help them. This is implied in the specification on the way, right? The angel is lishmorcha, maybe it's here, penach elcha b'derech, lest I consume you on the way. So you're going to have that angel for that period of time. Concerning all of this it is written, and the people heard this evil thing, and they mourned, and no one put on his ornaments like mourners. What this implies then is a cancellation of God's concession to having the Mishkan built. God announces that God's presence will be removed from the midst of the camp, with a return to the original intention that God's guidance of the people will be devoid of any tangible expression. At the first stage of conquest of the land, they will be accompanied by an angel, but afterwards the nation will have to become accustomed to faith in God with no intermediary. They will lead a completely natural life. As we continue to read the rest of the Parshiot in Sefer Shemot and Vayikra, we see that the divine presence does indeed reside in the Mishkan, meaning that this second degree concerning the angel is likewise cancelled, right? God said, I'm going to do an angel. Moshe convinced God, no. God does the Mishkan. Then God says, I'm not even going to do the Mishkan. I'm not going to be with you. But then what happens? God is there in the Mishkan. How does that work? What leads to this cancellation? How does Moshe have the courage to plead with God in this regard, after seeing with his own eyes the disastrous results of the path which he himself upholds? Meaning Moshe should recognize now this whole approach of tangible, presence of God doesn't work. How could Moshe have the chutzpah, so to speak, to ask God to continue in this way? In between the decree of the angel and the Parshiot of Vayakhel Pekudei, we must see what took place between God and Moshe after God effectively announces the end of the Mishkan project. And again, end of the Mishkan project doesn't mean that we're going to find in the text that God ever says, you know what, forget it about the Mishkan. She's just reading that in from the fact that God says, I'm not going to dwell amongst you, and I'm going to send an angel instead. Verses 12 to 23 describe a further argument between God and Moshe concerning the proper mode of the leadership of the nation. Moshe's request may be viewed as comprising three separate items. We will later see how each item receives a precise response, leading us to an understanding of what happens to the decree concerning the Mishkan. Okay, some beautiful close reading here. 1. Moshe clarifies his own status in light of the decree of the angel. So first Moshe says to God, here we are, this is Shemot chapter 33, this is in Kitisa, so next week's Parsha after Tetzaveh, in the wake of the sin of the golden calf, Moshe's conversation back and forth with God. Moshe said to God, see, you say to me, bring up this people, right? That's what we had read just above. God says to Moshe, go up, you and the people, etc. So now Moshe said to God, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, that I may find favor in your sight, and see that this nation is your people. Malbim explains, when Moshe says, you say to me, bring up this people, he means without making the Mishkan, because you will not dwell in their midst, just that I should bring them up to the land by means of the angel. Right, so the Malbim is saying that Moshe seems to be understanding that the message about the angel is that God is saying, yeah, no Mishkan, I'm not going to be in your midst, and that means no Mishkan. But Moshe says, but you have not made known whom you will send with me, meaning You have not made known whom you will send for the purposes of my prophecy. Will my prophecy too be through an angel, through a glass that is not clear like the rest of the prophets, or not? Meaning, how am I going to communicate with you? For you have said only, I shall send an angel before you, and I shall drive out the Canaanite. But you have not explained whether the angel will accompany me too for my purposes concerning prophecy, i.e. that my prophecy will be through him. God therefore answers, continuing on in the Psukim, Panay elechu v'hanichoti lach. My countenance shall go with you, and I shall give you, lach in the singular, rest. So the Malbim comments, God tells Moshe that with regard to his, meaning Moshe's prophecy, even now it will not be through an angel or any intermediary, but rather only mouth to mouth. In this matter my countenance will go, I myself, not through an angel or intermediary. The angel will precede the nation only in the matter of inheriting the land. Meaning, I'm going to stick with you, Moshe. I'm going to communicate with you. I just won't be in the Mishkan. There won't be a Mishkan. I won't be with the people. They'll have an angel. Step 2. Moshe doesn't accept the distinction between the mode of guidance of him personally and the mode of guidance of the nation as a whole. He threatens to end his leadership if God's countenance will not accompany the entire nation. This chapter, by the way, Shemot chapter 33, is very opaque, and the conversations are not clear. And she's doing us a favor here, attempting to sort of parse it out. It's worth going back afterwards or waiting till next week's Parsha to read chapter 33 and see if the reading makes sense. But with the aid of the Malbim here, we're coming to this approach. So then Moshe says to God, if your countenance will not journey, implication with us, right, because it continues us in the plural, do not take us up from here. For in what way shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not in your journeying with us that I and your people are differentiated from everyone upon the face of the earth? Right, Malbim says, this suggests that Moshe says, if your countenance won't accompany the entire nation, also in the matter of inheritance of the land and leadership of the nation, meaning don't send an angel, don't just give me prophecy, but give an angel to everybody else, then do not bring us up from here. For even if I myself have found favor in your sight in the matter of prophecy, I want the nation too to find favor in your sight, and that you will lead them yourself with no intermediary. To this God responds, Gam et hadavar hazeh asher dibarta e'aseh. Right? Also, this thing which you have spoken I will do, for you have found favor in my eyes, and I know you by name. God's answer does not satisfy Moshe. It sounds like God is saying, okay, I'll go with the people also. For Moshe's question had been, in what way shall it be known then that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? While God's response refers to Moshe alone finding favor, right? God seems to be saying, I'll go with everybody, but I'm only on good terms with you. I'm begrudgingly going with the rest of the Jewish people. He therefore goes on to ask, show me, I pray you, your glory. Here he seeks to test God's readiness to have God's presence dwell amongst Israel. Hareini na'ad kavodecha. God's answer, again, limits God's revelation to Moshe alone, and only when he is high on the cliff, far removed from the eyes of the nation. It seems then that Moshe's request is not fulfilled, right? What goes on there is God says, I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock, and I'm going to pass over, and you're going to see my back, and the 13 attributes of mercy, etc. Right? So Moshe has asked for God to find favor with the whole nation, and God responds about something God's going to do with Moshe only. It seems then Moshe's request is not fulfilled. At the end of God's revelation to him, he pleads once again. He said, I pray you, if I have found favor in your eyes, let the Lord, I pray you, journey in our midst. For it is a stiff-necked people, and forgive our iniquity and our sin and our transgression. From Shemot 34. Malbim explains, even though God had said to him, and also this thing which you have spoken I shall do, God had not promised that God would do it right away. And in addition, Moshe had asked then only that God's countenance, meaning God's divine presence, would journey with them. But now he asks that the name of Adonai will accompany them, the name indicating the attribute of Malchut, which is God's glorious presence, and that God commanded the Mishkan be built, and that God would reside in their midst, for this had not yet been promised. God's response to Moshe's last supplication includes the promise of a covenant, but there seems to be no clear, unequivocal answer concerning Moshe's request that the divine presence reside in the Mishkan. When Moshe comes down from the mountain, and this is an important detail to understand in her reading, when Moshe comes down from the mountain, he doesn't know whether God will cause God's presence to rest in the Mishkan amongst the nation. Right? And it was when Moshe came down, this is now the end of Parshat Ki Tisa, when Moshe came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony in Moshe's hand when he came down from the mountain, that Moshe did not know that the skin of his face shone as God spoke with him. Moshe is not aware of the divine presence that had descended upon him, while the people see that his face shines, but do not understand the significance of this phenomenon. It's with this lack of knowledge and lack of understanding that the people commence the building of the Mishkan. So this takes us to the end of Kitisa, and the resolution being that God has said that God is going to kind of go along with the people, but may not show favor to the people. And Moshe sort of asked for clarity about the Mishkan and hasn't really gotten it. And so what's going to be? The Parshiot of Vayakel and Pekudei, which appear to be a superfluous repetition of all the details of the command to build the Mishkan, turn into a story of suspense, at the center of which is the question of whether God will cause God's presence to rest on the Mishkan. Moshe received no clear answer concerning the command to build. However, in contrast to the punishment of the spies, where the people are forbidden to pursue the journey to Eretz Yisrael after expressing doubts, there's no prohibition on building the Mishkan after the sin of the golden calf, right? Remember, after the sin of the scouts, God says, no, you're going to wander in the land, you're not going to go into the land. And then there's that group, the Mapilim, who say, no, we messed up, okay, we'll go into the land. And God says, don't do it, it's not going to go well. And they get beaten back, and it's terrible, right? Here, God doesn't tell Moshe, okay, fine, build the Mishkan, but God also doesn't say, because of their sins, the Mishkan should not be built. So it's this ambiguous space. And again, what she's suggesting to us, if we read the whole story this way, as we read Vayakel and Pekudei, we're waiting to find out, how is it going to play out? Is God's presence going to be there or not? And this is, it adds this layer of tension to the story. Put to the test now is the degree to which the people will commit themselves to this tremendous construction project in terms of manpower and resources, which represents a potential for the divine presence to dwell in their midst, but which may turn out at the end to have been in vain. The Parshiot of Vayakel and Pekudei describe the universal enthusiasm of all sections of the nation, who all clamor to be part of the project, some by contributing materials, other by offering their skills. Right now she's got highlighted, lots of the uses of coal everywhere where it describes everyone, everything, right? And they came, every person whose heart stirred him, and everyone whose spirit made him willing, beginning of Vayakel, and they brought God's offering for the work of the tent of meeting and for all its service and for the holy garments. They came, men and women alike, all willing of heart, bringing nose rings and earrings and rings and bracelets and all jewelry of gold. And every person who had offered an offering of gold to God, and every person who had in his possession blue, purple, and scarlet, and fine linen, and goat's hair, and red skins of rams, and tachash skins, brought them. Everyone who offered an offering of silver and brass brought God's offering, and everyone who possessed shittim wood for any of the work of the service brought it. And all the women who had wisdom of heart spun with their hands, and brought that which they had spun of blue and purple and scarlet and fine linen. And all the women whose heart stirred them with wisdom spun goat's hair. The princes brought shoham stones, stones for setting in the ephod and for the breastplate, the spice and oil for anointing and for the incense of spices. Bnei Israel brought as a willing offering to God every man and woman whose heart prompted them to bring for all of the work which God had commanded to be done by the hand of Moshe. And then the next chapter, B'Tzalel and Aholiab and every wise-hearted man to whom God had given wisdom and understanding to know how all the manner of work for the service of the sanctuary did according to all that God had commanded. Moshe called B'Tzalel and Aholiab and every wise-hearted man in whose heart God had given wisdom, everyone whose heart stirred him up, to come forward to the work to perform it. They took from before Moshe all of the contribution, this could have been bolded too, which Bnei Israel had brought for the work of the service of the sanctuary with which to do it, and they were still bringing him free will offerings each morning, and all the wise men who were carrying out all of the work of the sanctuary came from the work which he did. The outpouring of enthusiasm is such that at some stage the torrent of contributions must be halted. They said to Moshe, saying, the people are bringing much more than enough for the service of the work which God has commanded to do. And Moshe gave the command, and a proclamation was made throughout the camp, saying, let neither man nor woman do any more work for the offering of the sanctuary. I think man nor woman. So the people were restrained from bringing, but the material which they had was sufficient for all the work needing to be done, and beyond. V'hotel. From here, the Parshiot go on to describe the precision with which the vessels of the Mishkan were built, all in accordance with the command in Parshiot Truma and Tetzaveh. The refrain of Parshat Pekudei is the confirmation, Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe, as God had commanded Moshe, concluding every description of the completion of some vessel or of the Mishkan or some article of the priestly clothing. The repeated emphasis gives eloquent expression to the tension of the people and their understanding that in order to increase the chances that God will indeed choose to bring God's presence to rest in the Mishkan, everything must be done with great precision and in complete, absolute subservience to God's instructions. Now, she hasn't told us here where or whether Moshe communicated to Bnei Israel, I don't really know if God is going to bring God's presence in the Mishkan, but we better, if we want a chance, we better cooperate, as we say in our house. If you want a chance, you better cooperate, right? She doesn't make clear that Moshe has communicated that, but somehow that must be the case based on what she said here. God's first revelation in the process of the construction is at the end of the preparation of the vessels and the structure of the Mishkan, end of Parshat Pekudei. In contrast to the original command, where Moshe was required to convey the command to Bnei Israel, here the command is addressed to Moshe alone. The description of the execution of the command following God's revelation likewise focuses on Moshe, and here too each of his actions is summed up with the words, Moshe did, or arranged, or placed as God had commanded Moshe. The optimism aroused by God's revelation is still reserved, since the degree to which Am Yisrael will be party to the revelation of God's presence is still a mystery. Right, so somehow we have the sense that in Moshe carrying out God's instructions for setting up the Mishkan, maybe God actually did communicate something specific to Moshe, but do we know that that means that it's going to work for everybody? Too soon to tell. At the height of the suspense, the Mishkan is standing, the vessels are ready in their places, Aharon's sons are dressed in the priestly garments and reviewing the laws of the Mishkan service, which they have practiced over the 8 days of inauguration. Everyone is waiting with anticipation to see the answer to the question, if I have found favor in your eyes, I and your people, and whether God will journey amongst the people. And the answer arrives. Very, very end of the book of Shemot. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and God's glory filled the Mishkan. And Moshe could not come into the tent of meeting, for the cloud rested atop it, and God's glory filled the Mishkan. The continuation of this climactic moment is recorded 3 parshiot later into Vayikra in Parshat Shmini. A fire emerged from before God, and it consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fats, and all of the people saw it, and they shouted and fell upon their faces. And by the way, Rashi and even just reading through the psukim, in the end of Tzav and in the beginning of Shmini, you do get this sense that whether they've known all along that it wasn't clear whether God's presence was going to come down or not, you feel the tension. It's the 7-day inauguration ritual, setting it up, and then it's the 8th day, and Moshe says, on this day God's going to appear, but it's still going through the final sacrifices and raising their hands and blessing the people, and we are sort of waiting for this moment of God's appearance. So it's very much there, and she's really stretched it out and drawn it out for us. The tremendous relief occasioned by the revelation of God's presence serves to explain the extent of the sin of Nadav and Avihu, who had not internalized the lesson of the sin of the golden calf. They did not recognize the extent of the gesture and the opportunity afforded them by God to repent for the sin through absolute precision in carrying out the details of God's command. Right? Again, here we can, when their sin is described as offering a strange fire, asher lo tziva lehem, that God had not commanded, that's in Parshat Shmini, but now we can read it against the backdrop of Vayakel and Pekudei, whereas all these kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe, kasher tziva Hashem et Moshe, and now they go and do something not in accordance with how they were commanded. Again, we always can ask a lot of questions about the death of Nadav and Avihu, but that's the framework she wants to provide around it. They dared to sacrifice a strange fire which God had not commanded them. Aharon, more than anyone else, had yearned for the divine presence to appear, thereby expressing forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf. He truly understands the extent of what his sons have done, and therefore, again, just in these few sentences, she's offering a lot of interpretation of these stories. Therefore, and Aharon was silent. Aharon's part in the sin of the golden calf will be the subject of next week's shiur. So we'll see Aharon's role and how he fits into the story. Again, as she's really, for us, taking a slow, careful read through, using the mafarshim that I think probably influenced her reading and develop her reading. And I think we now come to this spot where we understand the arc of what she's, highlighting for us, which is, following the conversations between Moshe and God about this modes of leadership and about how God's presence will manifest. And again, just to offer this quick summary, God's original plan all the way back in the burning bush is much more meditative, abstract worship. Moshe says, we need to see your presence, we need to feel your presence much more directly. God agrees. That takes them all the way through the Exodus and the revelation at Sinai. Then God says, okay, time to shift. Moshe says the people aren't ready yet. God agrees, God agrees to the Mishkan. Then the sin of the golden calf happens, and God sort of says, well, one way or another, I'm not doing it this way anymore. And then what we, focused on in this essay was the role of the Mishkan in light of God's ongoing, more tangible presence as a structure which mitigates against the risks of that tangible presence. And then, after God withdraws that commitment and sort of says the Mishkan's on the rocks here, the back and forth between Moshe and God, which seems to proceed with Moshe checking in about all of it, God saying, well, I'll still be with you, Moshe saying, please be with the whole nation, God seeming to indicate it, but not kind of closing it finally, and that leaving the Mishkan in question. And again, while she didn't make this explicitly clear, it seems like Moshe thereby comes to communicate to the people, if we do this Mishkan project well, and kind of use it as an opportunity to show that we are in lockstep with God, maybe God will return to our midst, and that goes well, and that ultimately happens. That sort of sets the stage for why Nadav and Avihu's sin is so stark in that moment. And again, then we'll go back to understand the sin of the golden calf. Lance, please.
Okay, number one, how does God use artificial intelligence to communicate?
I have no idea.
The Urim and Thummim.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. That's true. Yes.
And second question is, does God command Abraham to welcome the strangers?
Good question.
It's Genesis 18.
Right. I don't think it's written explicitly anywhere.
Well, I think what happens is, I think Abraham just had circumcision or something. And he was ailing or whatever. And God comes to him and starts talking to him. And Abraham says, wait a minute, God, I have something more important than talking to you about. I've got to go out and welcome these strangers. Right?
Yes.
Next point. Where in Tetzaveh is Moses' name found?
Not.
Not.
Well,
Why?
the first word, ve'ata, and you, but it doesn't say Moshe's name.
Doesn't say Moshe's name. And the problem that I have with all this is that I think there's a built-in prejudice against the Kohanim. And if you think about the golden calf, you will know that there are two versions.
So you can
one.
raise your hand. There's a way.
And most, as far as I know, almost every rabbi in the world only recognizes the first version, the omniscient narrator. But the second version is
Yes.
Aharon's testimony.
Hmm.
And what is Aharon's testimony?
I threw
That
it
the
into the
golden
fire and out
calf
came the... Yep.
emerges magically, and it is not a question of Aharon's creating it.
Yep.
Aharon does not create the golden calf according to Aharon.
Yes.
Right.
All right. Always speaking up for the priests, Lance.
Now, I want to ask you one further question, and that is, why is this day, today, the most important holy day in the Jewish calendar?
Today?
Well,
Today.
It is Zayin Adar, Moshe's yahrzeit. And birthday.
Moshe's yahrzeit. And what are you doing at HIR to observe Moshe's yahrzeit?
We might have our annual debate about whether or not to skip Tachanun, but otherwise, we're doing it right now, learning Torah.
There's never been at HIR any other attempt to recognize Moshe's yahrzeit.
Well, the Chevra Kadisha has a dinner every year.
That's true. Zayin Adar is also the Chevra Kadisha.
Unfortunately, it was snowed out tonight, but it is rescheduled, and you're invited.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right.
I have a comment.
Oh, yes. And then, thank you, Lance. We're going to go to Peter. Then I see Vanessa, welcome, has a hand up. And then we'll go to Joan and Moshe. Let's try to go in that order. Yeah, Peter, go ahead.
So Nadab and Abihu were punished by heavenly fire that entered their mouth. and that's how they perished. And in Sanhedrin, that is the punishment called strafa,
Mm-hmm.
and it comes from this precise moment. Unfortunately, strafa is implemented. I learned that by pouring hot lead into the mouth
Yes.
of the person who's to be punished. So
Yes.
just a little side comment, but this is exactly the place where this is taken from. And
Interesting. Very
and what?
interesting. Although I'm questioning, does it
Fire.
say that the fire entered their mouths?
I don't see that.
Yes, I mean
Where?
that's at least that's what I learned in Sanhedrin, Gemara Sanhedrin. That entered, and that is why we have skila, stoning, and strafa, and there was a big decision or question which is more severe, and skila is taken more strafa. I don't agree with that. I think strafa would be a more severe punishment, and it's only imposed on basically, as far as I can remember, bat kohanim,
Mm-hmm.
daughters of, and that's like the worst thing that you can
Yes.
do to them. Anyway, little aside,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and
Interesting. Yes.
and one other, just a mild point. I'm an engineer, retired and blind, but uh, I found not enough is given in the effort that it took to construct Mishkan. As an engineer, I can imagine the amount of labor that had to be imposed, and very little is said about that. Not enough due is given to the maybe perhaps hundreds of people who had to labor very hard to do all that. Just the weaving, the woodwork, and construction of the kruvim and gold plating. And by the way, I don't know how long did it take to construct the Mishkan. Is that given the amount of time, physical time?
I don't think it's 100% clear in the text. There are some different
Right.
rabbinic takes on, when it starts and and when it and the ending I think is a little bit clearer, but when it starts is not clear.
Yeah.
I'm just going to circle back to one thing you said first. I agree with you. The construction part does seem relatively, almost glossed over in the
Glossed
text.
over.
I think that's true, but the skilled craftsmanship is emphasized, but the process of construction is not.
It's not.
And just to back to your earlier point, I think that there's more rabbinic interpretation there. Meaning, I think the rabbis are looking to connect Nadav and Avihu as a potential source because of the similarity. The text in Shemini just says that the fire consumed them. It doesn't say specifically that it entered into them to consume
Well,
them.
as I learned Sanhedrin, it does mention that the fire entered their mouth because the body cannot be destroyed. Body is made in image of Hashem, and therefore it has to be kind of preserved, and that allows that. Well, I'm getting a call. Okay.
No problem. I'm going to put you on mute so you can answer, Peter. Thank you. Okay, I think we said we're going to go to Vanessa. Welcome. I don't know if we've met before, but thrilled to have you learning with us. And if you want to unmute, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Hi, it's really good to join your class for the night. I've heard so
Absolutely.
many good things about Hebrew Institute of Riverdale,
Thank you.
and
Welcome.
I'm also part of an open Orthodox community down in Florida. So
Terrific.
I know, super good to meet you guys. I just wanted to ask a question about the Parsha. So you talk
Yes.
about a couple of things, obviously about golden calf, and also about how Moshe was talking to God, and God said how God would be with Moshe, but not the rest of Israel, and Moshe kind of had to convince that. I kind of have one question kind of put into two different parts. So I'm just wondering, how in our daily lives do we stop modern day sort of reenactments of the golden calf, even if it's not like in things,
Hmm.
but it's in certain sorts of concepts, like, for example, popularity in school with the goyim and wanting to win their favor and having that be sort of almost as an idol at like
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how in school how we can stop that from happening and to keep our Judaism very, you know, very with us and very, not letting it slip for anybody else. And on that second point about Moshe talking to God and wanting it to be, not wanting God not to just be with him, but with the rest of Israel, how do we, with, if we're, in school and we're very out and Jewish and proud, but maybe
Mm,
going through a little bit of anti-Semitism because of
mm,
it,
mhm.
how do we, I don't want to say convince them because I never want to like tell anybody else what to do, but how do we, just like Moshe, inspire, a God, how do I describe it? Because it's kind of their actions that have to be done to kind of make it happen. But how do we like inspire other people to not chase after Goyim popularity, but to
Mm,
really do what Moshe said and to have God be not just with him, but with all of them, all of our Jewish classmates, and have us all
yeah.
be together and have God's presence as part of all of us, even if sometimes it doesn't win us favor with the
Yep.
rest of the
Yep.
world.
Yep. These are such powerful questions. I would love to pick up the conversation offline with you. So if you find my contact information on the shul website and drop me a line, I would love to talk more. Just on one foot, so to speak. I mean, my thought in this direction has always been first, the question is better or easier, and the answer is really hard. But I think, I think that I always start with trying to do exactly what you described. Focus on ourselves, our Jewish identity, being, proud Jews, modeling the Torah's vision of lives of goodness and kindness and justice. And, we can't guarantee the outcome of that. It certainly does not always like just automatically result in, um, the goals or the outcomes that we're looking for. But I still think that controlling the part we can control, and for lack of a better term, like living our best Jewish lives, I think is always the place to start. I think people who are oriented in a similar way will be drawn to that. And we'll see that, the internal motivations speak louder than the desire to win favor with anybody else, no matter who they are. But these are fantastic questions, and I look forward to getting a chance to talk with you more. Um, so
Thanks.
Joan and Moshe, and then David L.
Okay. All right. When Shlomo HaMelech built the first Mishkan, I mean the first Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan was still around. Now, the so-called implements that were in the Mishkan, were they the original ones from the time of Moshe, or were they that had to be replaced? Was the menorah the same menorah from Moshe Rabbeinu's time? What was
I think they were new, as far as it sounds like, from even the Haftarah, a little bit in the Haftarah from this past Shabbat from Teruma. It was new construction. All of it was new construction. What happened to the original vessels in the Mishkan? Great question. But I think it was new construction in the Beit Hamikdash and Solomon's Temple.
The Aron.
I believe so. Again, there's much more about the Aron Kodesh. I don't have. It's just my best recollection, but it's worth double checking. I will try to make a note on that.
That's what I want to know.
Great, great. David L.
Rev. Stephen,
Yeah.
your summary of the drashah was excellent, and you talked about how God's presence is manifested, and you used ambiguous terms as to whether this manifestation is exclusive or not. Our Darshanit, seems to suggest that the manifestation of God is exclusive to the person or to the place or to whatever. How do we, as post-Maimonidean Jews or Maimonidean Jews, with an understanding of an omnipresent God, understand these Parshiot?
Yeah.
A great question.
Thank you. Great question.
Great question.
I can come offline with Vanessa if you want.
For an after party, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, not surprisingly, I kind of like start by turning to Rav Yitz, and the kind of sense of an intensified presence in one location, which doesn't mean that God can't be accessed in other places, but that we sort of focus in on specific places where God can be accessed more intensively. Um, and I still think that in certain ways, that Beit Knesset and other particular communal centers are places which, whether I don't know how we could assess this in objective terms, but subjectively, experientially, those are places of more intensive or more, primary encounters with God. Um, yeah, but um, the notion of sort of traveling without God's presence or through with an angel, um, and then today, yeah, I think I start off with the Rav Yitz's approach that somehow there. I mean, I would take it a little bit initially at face value. It doesn't mean you can't connect with God, but the more intensive presence is in these particular places and less felt in other places. But now we live in a time where it's more diffuse and more widespread. But that's just a first reaction. And but I guess, yes, two things. One, I think there's more access to God in some way, more widespread somehow now, but at the same time, even in the absence of the Mishkan or the Beit Hamikdash, I think there are kind of places where that experience is more heightened, more available. Question.
But if I might just
Yeah,
point out,
yeah.
you pivoted a little bit
Yeah.
from the idea of God's presence to the idea of God's accessibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And yet our text really, if read at face value, seems like it's the presence, not just the accessibility.
Yes.
That's hard to understand.
Yes.
Can I add something to that?
Please.
I think it's more the experience of the presence.
Right. That's a way to bridge it. But I guess David is pushing on saying, well, what if we take the text at its face value, that it is God is there or not there. God is in a certain place or a different place or not in any place that, that is on an earthly, that is in an earthly realm.
But that's not how we experience. Is the text actually saying God is not there, or the text is saying that you sense the presence?
I think it's saying the former, right? When God says, like, I will not go with you. I will send an angel. I will be up here in heaven and I will not go with you, right? I came down on Mount Sinai and I was there. And now I'm, and I was going to be there in your midst when you build the Mishkan, but now I'm not going to. It's
very anthropomorphic.
Yeah, it's very anthropomorphic. Absolutely. Yeah. And we don't adopt such an approach now. But that's the biblical framework. Yeah. Great question. Much better question than answer so far. And continue to, think about it as we read through Shemot. And I think that's something she set up and invited us to do. Lance, back to you to wrap up.
Oh, please.
Okay, if I'm correct, in last week's Haftorah, God gives Solomon the gift of wisdom. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay, and yet in Solomon's Kohelet, wisdom is definitely considered vanity. All right?
It's so hard to say things. It's so hard to say things definitively about Kohelet. There are so many conflicting voices. So I'm not gonna land 100% there that all wisdom is vanity from Kohelet.
Well, what I'm trying to suggest is Kohelet does say something that you can do that's not vanity. And what's that?
Enjoy life with your wife?
I think more communally with your wife and your friends.
Yeah, okay, good. That too. Yep.
Dost think because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale. That's criticism of the Puritans, which is technically a criticism of Shylock, which is technically a criticism of the law, which is technically a criticism of halakha. and which is the point of view of the challenge of Christianity. Now, Rabbi Held seems to think that love is the common denominator between Judaism and Christianity. I would suggest no, that Judaism is about law, Christianity is about mercy. But the truth of the matter is that if you think about the Good Samaritan, who is the touchstone for Christianity, and the Good Samaritan is confronted or sees a Jew lying on the road who's beaten, and the Kohen and Levi each come along and each sees the dead body and says, "Oh no, the law says I can't get involved with this guy," right? But the Samaritan, who at that time and still today is considered a heretic, a no good, a sub rabbinic person, comes along and is the hero of the peace. You see, that's really crucial. That's really crucial. But I would suggest that the Samaritan does not do what he does because of either law or mercy.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I'll let all that settle.
Wait a minute, the Good
And,
Samaritan, is that Christianity or Judaism? The Good
It's
Samaritan.
neither. From my it's considered, it's in the New Testament, obviously,
New
and
Testament?
it's considered, Jesus says it, but from my point of view, the story is neither law or mercy.
all right,
The
we'll leave
story
that as
is-
another conversation for offline for now. I'm going to let everybody go and just note that next Monday night is Purim. So stay tuned. I think we may try for Tuesday night for those who are in a state at the end of Purim or after Purim to learn a little Parsha. And we'll stay tuned to your email. We'll figure that out. But wishing everybody a good, safe rest of the week, and in advance a Purim Sameach. Great to see everybody again. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us, and love to mom and dad, and take
Thanks.
care all. You bet. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.